I've been married to my wife for 4 years. Though we're relatively new to marriage, we dated for 2 years before tying the knot. Our relationship always felt strong, with no visible cracks. Our love was genuine, and we took the time to build a foundation of trust during our courtship. I'm 30, and my wife is 26. The incident that shattered my trust in her unfolded on July 4th, during a party hosted by one of her close friends. But before I get into the events of that day, let me provide some context. About a week prior, my wife mentioned that her close friend had invited us to her annual 4th of July celebration. Normally, we'd arrange for our reliable babysitter to watch over our 3-year-old. We've always informed the sitter well in advance whenever we needed her, so I assumed this time would be no different. However, my wife told me she had already contacted the sitter, who regrettably couldn't take the job due to her packed schedule. While I was a bit disappointed, especially since finding quality time with my wife had become increasingly rare since our child was born, I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. My wife suggested that I stay home with our little one while she attended the party alone. She expressed how much she wanted to go, and not wanting to stifle her happiness, I agreed. Still, I had my reservations. My wife's friend is younger, only 23, and has a carefree, single lifestyle. While I've never tried to control my wife or her friendships, I've always felt that this particular friend could be a questionable influence. Despite my misgivings, I wanted my wife to have fun, so I pushed my concerns aside. Now, here's where the situation took a sharp turn. On the morning of July 4th, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I thought, what if I offered the babysitter a higher hourly rate to reconsider? Maybe we could both attend the event together. If successful, I'd surprise my wife with the good news. Since my wife usually handled all babysitting arrangements, I didn't have the sitter's contact information. So, I went through my wife's phone to find her number and called. My plan was simple. Convince the babysitter to change her mind. To my surprise, when I mentioned the date and asked if she could reconsider, the babysitter sounded confused. She paused before saying, "This is the first I'm hearing about July 4th. That response threw me completely off guard. I pressed further, asking if my wife had contacted her at all. The sitter assured me she hadn't received any calls or messages from my wife regarding that day. Trying to recover from the shock, I improvised, saying that my wife must have contacted a family member instead. That was when it hit me. My wife had lied. But why? What reason could she possibly have to fabricate a story about the babysitter's availability? I thanked the sitter, quickly arranged for her to come over at 10 p.m., and made one last request, asking her not to mention anything about this arrangement to my wife. I needed time to process everything and figure out my next steps. My wife had already mentioned she'd be leaving for the party around 8 p.m., so I planned to let the babysitter arrive after she was gone. By then, a gnawing suspicion had started to take root, though I couldn't fully articulate what I feared the most. I had planned a special surprise outing for my wife, intending to keep it a secret. However, when confirming the babysitter's arrival, she inadvertently mentioned my wife's earlier attempt to arrange the same date and time. I quickly covered by explaining that we both thought the evening might have been cancelled, but since my wife was now on board, it would still be a delightful surprise. Around 8 p.m., my wife left, and I waited patiently for the babysitter, who arrived punctually. Once everything was set, I made my way to the party my wife had mentioned earlier. Admittedly, I had a nagging suspicion she might not attend and go elsewhere instead. To my surprise, upon arrival, her friend greeted me warmly and quickly called her over. Her reaction to seeing me there was far from what I anticipated. It wasn't just shock, it was pure disbelief. In the short 3 hours since she had left home, she already seemed visibly intoxicated. Her eyes were red, her demeanor distant, and her tone icy as she repeatedly asked why I was there and who was taking care of our child. I reassured her that the babysitter had everything under control and that I had come to spend the evening with her, enjoy the party, and watch the fireworks display together. The gathering was intimate, with 15 to 20 people crammed into the house. One thing stood out immediately: the skewed gender ratio. There were almost twice as many men as women. Most of the partygoers were mingling or engrossed in games, particularly a spirited round of Truth or Dare. As I tried to ease into the setting, my wife's behavior turned agitated. She seemed restless, avoiding eye contact, and eventually insisted we leave. Her abruptness felt odd, raising an internal alarm that she might be concealing something. I assured her we'd leave soon, but first, I wanted to try a drink and acquaint myself with the scene. In the kitchen, I struck up a casual conversation with one of the men. After a brief introduction, I asked if he was enjoying himself, to which he responded positively. Looking to gather more context about the party dynamics, I casually mentioned my interest in approaching one of the women. I pointed to the attendees, one by one, and he candidly shared who was in a relationship and who appeared open to advances. This casual exchange was telling in ways I hadn't expected, painting a clearer picture of the night's undercurrents. I found myself standing in the middle of a revelation that turned my world upside down. A stranger, unaware of the connection between us, pointed out my wife in the crowd and casually commented on her beauty. Intrigued, I pressed him for more details. That's when he revealed something that shattered my heart. He described her as off-limits because she was involved with a mutual friend of his. Feigning interest, I encouraged him to elaborate. He shared how my wife had met this man at a concert and that their relationship had since turned intimate. His words hit me like a ton of bricks, especially when I realized the timeline matched perfectly with an event we both attended just a month ago. I vividly remembered that night. We were together most of the time, except when she insisted on fetching snacks alone. She had been gone for an unusually long time, but I brushed it off, thinking there was a long line or that she needed a restroom break. Since then, there had been small but noticeable changes in her behavior. Frequent absences from home, an impromptu trip out of town. Pieces of the puzzle started falling into place, and the picture they painted was devastating. As the stranger continued to talk, he described my wife with a certain arrogance, almost as if boasting about her like a prize his friend had won. The casual indifference in his tone made my blood boil. Moments later, my wife's friend joined the conversation, clearly sensing where it was headed. Her evasiveness only confirmed her complicity in the deception. I excused myself, asking my wife's friend where she was. She suggested I check the patio. That's where I found my wife, deep in what seemed like an intense conversation with a man. Her body language betrayed her. She was either pleading or trying to justify something. I approached them calmly but firmly, introducing myself to the man as her husband. My wife immediately tried to pull me away, urging me to leave the party. I shook off her hand, my anger barely restrained, and told her she was free to leave. I intended to have a word with her companion. Turning to him, I asked a straightforward question. Did you know my wife was married when you got involved with her? My tone carried enough weight to make him hesitate. I wasn't looking to start a fight, but I wanted answers. My imposing demeanor served its purpose, unsettling both of them. My wife grew visibly anxious, trying to apologize and defuse the situation, but I wasn't having it. The man, cornered and clearly nervous, stammered out an apology. He claimed he had no idea she was married when they first started seeing each other. I pressed him further, asking how many times they had been together. His answer only solidified what I already knew. Satisfied I had the truth, I wished him a good night, walked away, and left the party. I got into my car, drove home, and told my wife in no uncertain terms that I wanted a divorce. Her pleas and apologies fell on deaf ears. I packed a bag and checked into a hotel, where I now sit, pouring my thoughts onto this page in an attempt to make sense of it all. The betrayal has left me hollow, physically sick, and unsure of what steps to take next. Divorce is uncharted territory for me, and the thought of co-parenting is daunting. I didn't grow up in a household like that. What I do know is that I can't continue in this marriage. My trust has been shattered beyond repair. As I write this, I'm contemplating my next moves, knowing I need to prioritize my mental health and well-being. For now, I'm navigating this storm, unsure of what lies ahead but resolute in my decision to move forward.